show one or two, he had a room filled with haystacks at different times of day. So for the one particular exhibition, when this was painted, he had 15 haystacks within the room that were painted at totally different times. And this was in a solo art show at the Durand-Ruel Gallery. So one of the big emphases here is the formal elements of the canvas. The content is not so important, although haystacks are still symbols of rural prosperity. But you can see it's not like he's telling a story. There's no narrative here. It's the way in which color and line and shape and so on are affected. And so these are all formal elements, experiments in texture and color choices and things like that. So there's an emphasis more on the idea of aesthetic subjects as opposed to documentary subjects. Probably most famous from this period are his water lilies. And this is his house at Giverny. And he created this amazing garden. That's him as an old man. And part of his sort of landscape project was there was a stream that was going through the property, which he had dammed. And the dam created these great ponds, which he planted water lilies in them. So they are these incredible lily ponds that are dispersed throughout the property. And that becomes the focus of his painting. And it's really interesting how he approaches this. It's not like he's painting a body of water, a horizon, and a sky in a kind of traditional mode. Instead, we really barely even have a horizon. The focus is on, again, the shifting perceptions as you look at the pond, the reflections that you get from the trees, the clouds and so on, the different color of water at different time of day, the different way the water lilies look at different moments of the year. And it's done with this incredibly loose brush. It's almost on the verge of abstraction. You can see how pure abstraction can be the next step. And interestingly enough, he starts to go blind at this time. And there's great kind of discussion about whether, did he know he was being blurry, or is it just he couldn't see what he was doing? And I think, you saw how old he was. He certainly had a sense of how to paint, and he just, he was painting in this way that was pushing the boundaries. Here's another view, and these are absolutely gorgeous, and there are many of them around, the smaller pieces, but he also did entire walls of water lilies, and they're in museums in Paris and New York, and when you go up to them, the paint is like 2 or 3 inches thick. The texture is just absolutely luscious. They're so gorgeous. He had a bridge installed in the lily ponds, and it's based on bridges in Japanese gardens. So he was absolutely obsessed with Japanese culture and used that as a motif in many of his paintings. This is actually a photo. The house at Giverny is a museum now, and this is his dining room. And you can see his love of color, but also you can see his collection of Japanese prints all around, which is very instructive for art historians. Another view, and again, just looking at he's just loving the play of color and shape, regardless of what he's painting at all. It becomes so separate from the reality that he sees it. It just exists on the canvas. And another. Edgar Degas in the 1880s begins a new theme that was to become an important focus for his art. And he does a series of bathers. And they're very interesting because they're close-up views of women engaged in the private act of bathing. And often they're done in pastel. Now, your book talks about these as absorptive subjects as opposed to, they juxtapose it against his dancers, which they say are his performative subjects. But if you remember, the works that we looked at were not always the images of performance. A lot of them really captured women who were unaware of our presence, much the same way as the bathers. In all of his bather images, there's no recognition of the presence of the viewer by the women. It's almost like we are voyeurs who are viewing them without their knowledge, just as we are here with the dancers. And in fact, at the time, they were literally referred to as works that suggested a keyhole view of women bathing. And that's very interesting. There are lots of formal experiments that Degas is working with here. I mean, this viewpoint alone, looking down in a kind of bird's eye view with this flattened out sort of table on the right, and then strange perspectives that he's playing with, where the pitcher and this other vessel, they look almost like they're lying on their sides. So he's playing with traditional perspective representations and thinking of new ways to present space and to present objects in a much more two-dimensional way. And he too was tremendously influenced by Japanese prints. And you can see here the same kind of cropped viewpoint, and we're looking down, and the flattening out of shapes, so that we're really talking about a two-dimensional flattened composition of shape and form. Here are some others. And again, the gorgeous pastels. What your book doesn't talk about with these, though, and which is very interesting, is the social meaning behind the images and the social meaning behind the act of bathing. Paris had a really polluted water system at the time that was full of disease, and it was considered by middle-class women to be very unhealthy to bathe. So bathing was not done very often. It was believed that it caused miscarriages, that you could contract diseases and all sorts of things. But prostitutes had to bathe by law. They had a medical commissioner who would come in and inspect the prostitutes to make sure that they were bathing to protect their clients. And so what we're looking at are images of prostitutes. And the viewing public would have known this at the time, because no sort of middle-class woman is going to pose for Degas in these kind of attitudes. And that makes it very interesting, because we are being presented a really different kind of representation of the prostitute, very different from anything we've seen up to now, or even in terms of the presentation of the nude woman. The nude woman is traditionally presented as beautiful, as idealized, as passive and sexually available. This really rocked the art world. They didn't know what was going on. They said, why does he present them looking so ugly? And that was the thing. Oh, these women, they look so ugly. He makes them look like animals, because they weren't used to seeing that kind of artistic presentation. He has, in his prints, he does a series of prints in the brothel as well, which were not intended for large public viewing. They were intended for friends, and Picasso actually ended up owning a set. But you can see how awkward he is representing the women. They certainly aren't the kind of traditional perception of the very sexually beautiful, eroticized female. It's, you know, a naked woman scratching her butt, basically, something you come across as you're walking through a room. And here again, we've got sort of the bathing on the right, and then the women unaware that he's there. He's this kind of voyeur coming into their space, so catching them in their natural environment. And the whole thing is, the brothel is very unglamorized. I mean, you look at these women, they look bored, they look kind of worn out. this does not look like it's a fun time and a great job. It's sort of what they're having to do out of necessity. And then here are a couple here as well. And that even stands in huge contrast to images of prostitutes that we're used to seeing, right? Like Manet's Olympia. Olympia is certainly intended to be provocative, but it still falls into the tradition of the display nude, if you will. She's certainly aware of our presence. In fact, she's kind of challenging our presence. But, you know, we're used to seeing Ingres and his Odalisque, for example, who, you know, looks at the viewer, and numerous other ones, Cabanel, and so on and so forth. But this is where Degas, he's just so different, and people couldn't get used to it. So yeah, just to compare this representation of the prostitute to this representation, it's very, very different. Another very controversial work by Degas was a bronze sculpture that he did of a young dancer. It's called Little Dancer of 14 Years. And interestingly, he first did it in wax and then put an actual tutu on her. And it was exhibited behind glass, like Madame Tussauds Wax Museum. And it was very disconcerting for people. This one is one of the bronze versions. And what people couldn't get over is the intense reality and what they called the intense ugliness. They felt that she looked repugnant and that this was proof of something that was gravely feared, and that's the idea of human degeneration, which they accorded to the lower classes, like the dancers. The idea that Darwin's theory of evolution was something that could backfire. That was the fear, that people could degenerate to a lower condition. And so here this was, again, something that touched a nerve of what people were fearful of in society, and certainly something they didn't want to be confronted with in art. In art, they wanted something beautiful, something to escape to, not a real down-to-earth young girl. The whole bathing thing is very interesting too, with artists of the latter part of the 19th century in France. Even it was part of the Impressionist subject matter, the modern subject matter, and sometimes artists would step out of the tradition of the female and look to the male. And this is Frederic Basile's representation of modern male bathers. So the idea of swimming, the act of leisure. And swimming was something that was controversial because there was a fear of epidemics and people being exposed to various illnesses. So just a very unconventional kind of theme for presentation. It's not nymphs cavorting in some kind of a river like we would see with Fragonard or Boucher. These are 19th century guys in swim trunks at the swimming hole. The male nude was also something that was done in a very controversial way by Degas. This is a very early work, but it's called Young Spartans. And classical subjects usually demand a kind of idealized heroic nude. And yet, here we see the young boys on the right. There's something almost a little bit disturbing about the way in which Degas is presenting them in his sort of a pre-pubescent kind of way. Again, just kind of shocked the viewers of the period. And then Gustave Caillebotte, who did Rainy Day Paris, did a painting, and this one's not in your book, but it's so interesting. It's very much like Degas' Bathers, only this time it's a man who we are observing like voyeurs in this very intimate, private act of bathing. He's unaware of our presence, and certainly his body's not idealized. This isn't the nude, the heroic nude that was so championed in the salon. And the reality of the scene, too, is quite incredible, like the reflection of the metal tub, his wet footprints on the ground, and again, just showing the provocative nature of some of the Impressionist works. So bathers were a theme that the male Impressionists embraced, and female Impressionists too, but if you're a female Impressionist, you were very constricted. You couldn't go to the brothel. You couldn't walk into a worker's rooming house and paint men in the bathtub. And so Mary Cassatt painted what she saw around her, and that was family members, people, staff who worked for the family. And in this case, this is a depiction of one of her nieces and a housemaid. Or a nanny that worked for the family. Still very progressive, very, very modern. We have that bird's eye view, the Japanese print influence. We have the chalky brushstrokes that are so typical of the Impressionists. But the difference is that we have not that sense of looking at people that we don't know. There's a sense of intimacy between those two. There's a psychology that goes on. And it's because these are members of Mary Cassatt's family who she knows very well. And so it becomes a very intimate portrait of a child bathing. And then this one, you can see the nurse or the nanny has been asked to model for Mary Cassatt, and she's wearing the same dress. This is a monoprint, so it's an imitation of a Japanese print. So she's doing the kind of bathing. It's similar to Degas. It's not quite as fully nude as Degas, but it gives that sense of viewing this very private and intimate act, but still presenting the figure, I don't think really animal-like, in much more dignified way. But just kind of interesting to see how they're working with this theme. And then Renoir takes the theme in a different direction. He sort of gets tired of painting contemporary scenes of life in Paris and so on and so forth. And he yearns for the sort of the old masters, but he wants to bring the old masters to life. So he paints these kind of works, like the bathers, from the perspective of a kind of a timeless environment, that kind of elegance that he perceived from the past, but not like Ingres, where there's a sort of ideal quality. I mean, he still shows sort of, you know, there's the odd thing like elements, the roles. These are actually women with distinctive personalities and distinctive features and so on. And the public loved it. So not sort of Ingres, every single work by Ingres looks like it's the same person. She's this perfected, idealized figure, whereas Renoir takes it in a bit of a different direction. The idea of updating a representation of the female nude was also the focus of a work by Paul Cézanne. He's a super interesting artist. He was kind of an eccentric. He was brilliant. He could spout off writings of from Ovid or some of the other classical writers, but he swore like a trucker. You know, he was that kind of guy. And he, early on in the 1870s, he did some very strange works, and this is one of them. It's called A Modern Olympia. And Cézanne was severely criticized for this. So what do we see? So A Modern Olympia, immediately we know it's a reference to Manet's work, right? And so we've got the nude reclining on a bed. We have the black servant. We have even the black cat. But what we have is the flaneur sitting there. So is this a brothel scene? Is she unveiling the female to be consumed or whatever by the man? The thing is, it's quite ambiguous. It looks a lot like Cézanne, so is this actually Cézanne and is this his fantasy? The point of it is it's supposed to be kind of ambiguous, and also it's a very kind of intelligent play on tradition, because Manet's work, if you remember, was a parody of the Venus of Urbino. So this is a parody of that parody. And so playing with in a very modern way. Critics hated it, hated Cézanne's work, wouldn't accept him to the Salon, made a cartoon about this, which they published in some kind of a journal that made fun of the artist. So after 1877, he never exhibited in Paris again, and he spent most of his time in his home of Aix-en-Provence. This is another, at this time, this is before the late 70s, before 1877. He did a whole series of works that really have not been studied enough, but are fascinating. This is an orgy. He did lots of orgy images, murders, rapes, like really dark, weird stuff. And that the modern Olympia is kind of part of that. And then he is introduced to the Impressionists, and he starts to move in a completely different direction, which is focusing much less on content or fantasy or whatever, and more on issues around the aesthetics of modern art, and especially the idea of structure. So this is a plate of apples, it's called. So just very benign, and you'll see that this is what Cézanne does. He chooses themes from this point on that are very sort of banal. There's no narrative content to them or anything. They're simply themes that give him an excuse to play with color and line and form, and just play with the act of painting. And he's very famous. Once he said, he did so many paintings of apples, he said, "I will astonish Paris with an apple," because he knew what he was doing was something that was so revolutionary. So let's see what it is. His work becomes an attempt to retrieve structure and pictorial order for painting. And he also wants to link painting once again to the greatness of the past. But he's doing it in a very modern way. And his famous saying is, we must do Poussin over again. Poussin, the famous French 17th century artist. We must do Poussin over again, this time according to nature. Poussin was a structuralist. And so this idea is that he wants to bring structure, but he wants to use nature, that which is given to the eye, as the basis for his art. And this is all based on a completely new conception of color, what color can achieve. So let's look at this historically. So this is a Poussin et in Arcadia ego, and this is sort of the traditional approach in painting to color, where the artist would carefully draw out all of the elements, do a very precise perspective structure, and then draw the figures in. Remember, we saw David, he would draw them nude, and then he would clothe them. And then after that, he would apply the paint. So color is secondary. Color is additive. It's not part of the structuring of the composition. And then along come the Impressionists. Color has a totally new function. It actually defines the forms. Certainly the Impressionists aren't doing these elaborate studies of the buildings and so on and so forth. They are painting what they see. So color defines the form, but the emphasis is on change, not on permanence and solidity. And then we have Seurat, who we just looked at, where color is given a structuring function. So it doesn't have the traditional Renaissance function of it's not the Renaissance approach of defining space and solid and then adding color, but color comes first. So Seurat is using those tiny, tiny little dots of color to build up his forms. And color defines both the space and the solid. And this is the kind of mentality that Cézanne takes in his approach. He uses color to structure the paintings, but in a different way from Seurat. Instead of tiny dots of color, he uses color planes. So he uses a palette knife, and you can clearly see that in this. You can imagine him taking a yellow straight out of the tube and applying it to the palette knife, and then putting that there, and then there, and there. So you can see that the series of interlocking planes, almost like a prism, it builds up the forms, but it also builds up the spaces. The background is just as solid and just as much a mesh of linking planes as the apples themselves. And same with the tablecloth. Same with the shadows. They have just as much density. So the entire canvas becomes a series of interlocking planes. And so now we have structure reintroduced. But he does something more with color. He uses color to establish spatial relations. So he knows that warm colors advance toward the viewer and cool colors recede. So warm colors like yellow and orange and a warm red seem to pop out towards us, whereas blue, purple, green, they move backwards. The eye reads it that way. So if you look at these apples, he's doing no light and shade at all. There's none of this gradation from darkness to light with a little highlight somewhere. We don't have volume and 3 dimensions created that way. He actually uses the color to create that sense of spatial recession. So we read this as being 3-dimensional, but not in the conventional way. So he's kind of rejecting the studio traditions of the past. He also rejects the idea that he has to copy exactly from nature. His sense is that his loyalty is to the aesthetic integrity of his canvas, not to what he sees in front of him. So he will cut some corners if it's going to make the canvas look better. So if you look, the tabletop here doesn't match up with the tabletop. We can't resolve where that line is. Also, look at the shape of the bowl. It's not kind of a symmetrical, accurate shape. And the thing is that he doesn't care, because what he feels is that the shape, line, and form on the canvas is more important than what it looks like in reality. And so he pulls the table down a bit because he wants some more yellow on that side. And he manipulates the forms in that way. So he sacrifices fidelity to nature for the aesthetic integrity, the symmetry and balance of the canvas. So the key is he's, in a very big way, he is mediating between the reality of nature and the reality of the picture. And we see the independence of the painting. It exists separately from the subject matter. It's something that the artist has created. Let's look at some more examples. He's really quite unconventional. So here again, we've got apples and still life. Looking at the apples, you can see that the warm colors pop out towards us, and then the cooler colors recede into space. And so there's that sense of depth created not through conventional light and shade, but through application of color theory. We also see, if you look at these buns, we're seeing them from 2 different perspectives simultaneously. We see them as if we're looking straight on, and then we see them as if we're looking from above. So when you think forward to the early 20th century, which isn't too long from here, and works by Pablo Picasso, who, along with Georges Braque, invents a movement called Cubism. It's all about multiple angles of viewing, about shattering that idea of just seeing things from one perspective in a work of art. And Picasso was a huge admirer of Cézanne, and so that's where this kind of thing starts. And then again, not staying true to the actual shape that he sees in life. Look at the bottle. It's one shape on one side and one on the other. It's not symmetrical. We also have this table thing going on here. The table is at one level here, and then it drops down over here, because he needs some more blue-gray to match the blue-gray that he's got here. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a balanced and harmonious piece. Another one, and this again, the emphasis on the planes of color, how solid the background looks, and also the cloth. It's just as solid as any of the other elements, and to the point where the highlights even become tangible planes of white. Again, no modeling in light and shade, and that sense of depth created through color, warm versus cool colors. This one, beautiful. You can really see the palette knife there, the evidence, and again, applying the paint in this very dense planimetric way, pure color, and then the idea of manipulating shapes. We have this compote here, which he realizes he's got this big piece of white happening down here, so he needs something to balance it in the upper left-hand corner of the canvas. So he simply elongates the compote and creates a beautifully balanced painting, regardless of what the objects look like in reality. Look at the goblet, too. We're looking simultaneously sort of at the water from the side, and we're kind of looking into the goblet as well. There are these multiple perspectives going on. Any questions? Clear? Well, he applies these ideas also to landscape, and so he lived in Aix-en-Provence, which is down in the south of France in Provence, and there's a huge mountain there. It's called Mont Saint-Victoire, and this is what it looks like. And he did pretty much what Monet did up in Normandy. He would sit and do painting after painting of this one mountain, Mont Saint-Victoire. And you can see how it sort of